Parkwood, that's after. That's before on Glen Circle, that's after. Okay, so it's happening everywhere as the previous presenters have said. Now this is pretty good news. This is before on Mount Vernon. You see those two big trees in the front yard, and you see the sort of wooded area in the back. Zoning worked for trees in this condition. I imagine it was the front yard setback that kept the building construction where it's going to be. That's what's going on now. So the forest area in the back is the same, the trees are the same in the front, and the new construction is happening in the area of the existing buildings footprint. Good news. Here's another really good one, and I want to go into some detail about this to show you the implications of our current ordinance in Decatur. This is 655 West Ponce Leon Avenue. This is on Trinity at the curve near, Ponce at the curve near Trinity. This is a before picture, and this is the survey, okay, of that land with the trees shown. Now there's a few, this is considered by the arborists to be about 89% canopy at the time of the survey. One tree was very sick, a 33-inch oak that had to be taken down. So it might not be quite 89%, but the survey includes trees around the boundary, not only on this property, and you'll see why that's important in a minute. So this is after, okay? There's virtually no change to the trees in this construction. This is the Harry family, was sort of dedicated to trying to build without. They loved the trees on the site. That's one reason they bought the lot. Richard M. Stevens, the architect, Century Craft Homes, they've been very caring in every way for the property. So this is before and after, okay? So there is really hardly any difference in the canopy. That 133-inch oak, I don't have a pointer near the pool, would have to be removed, okay? Now, they're doubling the square footage, so they're getting the big house that people seem to want. There's only a little bit of expansion. The hatched area on the, I put before on both of them, I'm sorry. The one on the right is after, so they're doing 2 stories, but it's basically the same footprint with an expanded porch. So it's just it's the same basic width and depth, and it's twice as tall. And so here's some of the things that could have taken place, okay? Now, in the current ordinance, you're allowed to get a benefit from trees that are not on your property if the canopy is shading your property. So there's a ton of trees on this land, but if there were not, this land would be getting credit from the green areas, which are not significant in the front, but in the back, that's quite a bit of square footage. Okay, and so this homeowner has no control over those trees, yet they would be contributing to the required canopy on this lot. Now, the current code requires that you save 25% of the existing canopy on a lot. So what you see is the way it could have been on the right, okay, without any variance or any problem. So if the Harrys had just simply chosen to cut down all those trees, they could have. And then 18 months later, the code would have allowed them to take 3 more trees down for any reason of any kind. Now, if originally they had decided to conserve specimen trees, or trees that the city's ordinance considers of high value, they would get double credit for them. So that's all they would have had to keep to make that 25%, because it would really only had to have been 12.5%. Now, if they were in total violation and had clear cut illegally, they would pay a fine. Unfortunately, the economics indicator doesn't really make that a significant problem. But they would have been required to replace trees that, when mature, would become 25% coverage. So they could have planted that, okay? So this is a wonderful story about the Harry family and the design team and the construction team, but that's how it could have gone. So that's what I wanted to tell you.
I'm going to talk about the builder's point of view a little. So builders vary in their concerns, but to prosper, they all have to make a profit. And basically, they're working backwards from the selling price. And there's an appraised value that they're usually working from, because if they're getting a loan from a bank, the bank is going to look at what the maximum selling price could be. And then they're going to try to control their costs and hopefully control unforeseen circumstances to minimize expenses beyond what they know they have to do to build a home. And that's the environment that they work in. At the same time, if we can level the playing field, as Catherine was talking about, so all builders have the same requirements and restrictions, then they're not going to feel like they're being unfairly penalized. Builders seem to really just, in the final analysis, they're so busy, and the process is such a demanding one for most builders that whatever gets worked out is as a legal requirement. Basically, builders need to know what they just need you to tell them, or the municipality to tell them what they need to know, and then they'll just build to that, and they know that they're not in any unfair situations compared to anybody else. So one option could be to look at, or a requirement could be smaller footprints, given the sustainable footprint and the tree matrix that Catherine talked about. And that means that some lots, because of the value of those trees, are going to only be allowed to build to that smaller footprint. For those of you who aren't familiar with Sarah Susanka, this is one example I give of an architect now with a national reputation, who has written extensively about how to build smaller, higher quality homes, and have spaces within the homes that typically are multi-purpose, have higher levels of finish. And it's a way to build smaller, but yet still have the value and the features that people want. So these are some more pictures of some of the spaces from her homes. Here's another example of a household, of a house that's a 3-bedroom, 3-bath. From my anecdotal experience, the majority of the new households I see moving into Decatur, into new homes, typically are 2 to 4 people per household. Yet I see many homes built to 4 or 5 bedrooms. What Sarah has are designs that can fit on a smaller footprint. Maybe they don't have quite that square footage, but they would have a higher quality space. And here are a couple. Here's the first floor footprint of the picture on the previous slide. So it's still got nice spaces in it. Still got a nice eat-in kitchen and dining and living spaces, and even a multi-purpose room there. And then the second floor shows 3 bedrooms, generous spaces, common spaces, and so forth. So builders typically look at the larger square footage as a way to maximize their profit. If the appraised values in the neighborhood are going up and other people are building larger homes, then they're going to want to build as large as possible to get as close to the maximum price as their competitors. But the value of smaller homes with quality design and finishes need not necessarily be lower in value. And the function, the value is really a function of location and the house's features. It's not just, it doesn't have to be pure square footage. And people, another thing to think about is that as a family's life cycle shifts and children grow up and leave, many people, and I know this from personal experience, and you may too, as people are aging and they're now empty nesters or whatever, they're less inclined to stay in a very large home than if the home is smaller and easier to maintain, easier to handle and so forth. So I think aging in place becomes more possible with smaller sized homes. Another thing I wanted to talk about was this idea of limiting the lot sizes, the building sizes, and the disturbance of soil that Catherine showed so well in her slides. One thing to consider is to limit let's say when a house is torn down that may have had a crawl space with a dugout area, full height maybe for a water heater in the basement that you see a lot in older homes in Decatur. If the new home that's built if the basement area is limited to that size footprint, then we're really limiting the amount of disturbance. And if the footprint of the whole house enlarges, how about building it with crawl space or even on piers, which is not something that's unusual. This was done earlier in the 20th century in homes all through Georgia, and it certainly allows a builder to build on a lot, reduce the amount of clearing and topsoil destruction that we see so commonly today. Finally, the idea of crawl spaces typically have been very unpleasant spaces in homes, and when they're built as encapsulated crawl spaces, which you see in this upper photo, they're actually healthier than the standard vented crawl space, and they're actually far more energy efficient. So that ends all of our slides and presentation, and I guess we're ready to take some questions. Should we all come up?
Maybe we can just sit here and pass the pass.
So if you have questions and you haven't turned in cards yet, then let people know on the sides so that they can feed questions. And I wanted to also, now that we're not quite so rushed to get started, make a couple mentions that the Decatur First United Methodist Church Creation Care Committee and Trees Atlanta are the sponsors of this event. And I wanted to acknowledge Beth Bond, who's president of the Creation Care Committee, and Judy Yee, who's the director of education for Trees Atlanta. Trees Atlanta has got a number of different events going on. So if you're not on their mailing list, make sure that you talk to Judy to get on their mailing list and find out some of the other events that they've got going on. I also wanted to acknowledge the Environmental Sustainability Board here, Stephen Blackburn and Susan Montgomery, and Decatur City Commissioner Kelly Walsh. I know that there were some other city commissioners that are at the Oakhurst Neighborhood Association meeting today, so they couldn't make it because it's at the same time. And also acknowledge Decatur Deputy City Manager Hugh Saxon. At the chance of missing somebody, if I didn't name you, you can come see me or send a note to one of the people on the side. Okay, so we'll start out with some of the questions that we have. So Amy, the city regulates the buildable area, but is there any regulation to the area of disturbance? And if not, how hard would that be to implement?
Gosh, Hugh could answer that question better than I can. Well, the disturbed area would be limited. I guess you can I'm not sure. Okay, I'm not sure, but I do know that if you disturb 10,000 feet, you trip detention. But I'm not aware of other restrictions to disturbance than that, besides the 25% canopy that needs to be maintained. So I may be answering that. I may not be answering that question, but I'd be glad to try to look into it.
For Amy and Howard, is it true what you hear from some developers that saving trees makes houses too expensive?
I haven't heard that from developers. I think that one problem we have is that if a development company uses more or less stock plans that don't change very much except for their site adaptation, then it can be quite expensive for them to change their mode of approach. However, I think that is because it is the wrong approach. With additions, major additions, new construction, or renovations that are site-specific, designed for the site, then I think there is some risk of a slight increase in cost because might be more perimeter. The most efficient building shape for cost-wise, Howard, tell me if I'm right, is to have as little perimeter as possible. So if your company makes, you have 5 or 6 types that you build, and they all have more or less square footprint perimeters, and you put them on a lot where the trees cause a zigzag, you have to take out trees if your economic model that is based on that type is going to be maintained. So that, I assume, is what the issue is, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Okay, so if you don't approach it that way, if you approach it that each site is a unique design solution to be made, even within historic standards, with the exception of perhaps having to do more perimeter to get your square footage to work around natural conditions, I would say that the answer is that the problem is completely solvable. Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I would only add that it depends on the builder, of course. Not everyone is using stock plans. And I see a number of, frankly, some very nicely designed homes in Decatur being individually designed by architects, right? And most of those are fairly complex designs. They're not necessarily that cheap to build to begin with. And I actually have faith in architects if they're going to be challenged to build to a more unique site because we're trying to keep trees and reduce site disturbance. I have faith in the creativity of architects to rise to that challenge and build us even more beautiful homes.
Hang on to that microphone. This is a clarifying question that came. Howard, what's an encapsulated crawl space?
The typical crawl space you see on older homes in Decatur has got vents in the walls. So there's typically bare dirt in there. They're not pleasant spaces. They're full of bugs. They're full of water often. And the unpleasantness in those crawl spaces can easily be communicated up into the house through the air leakage. Whereas with an encapsulated crawl space, it's really like a short basement where you seal it up, you insulate the walls, you condition it. And you saw that picture I had with the white plastic down. It actually becomes more of an asset to the home than a detriment.
Okay, this is a question that's come up on a couple of these questions. Who do we talk to about changing the codes for buildings and tree removals? For example, in this question, if people wanted to build with a different building material, I hear that's better for the root system, so how might something like that start?
That's interesting.
Yeah, well, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I'm thinking it actually comes down to creating regulations that work or work as good as possible, and then just, and I can't put this in more gingerly, you know, letting developers know these are the parameters within which you have to work to save tree canopy, to address stormwater issues, to address stormwater infrastructure issues, and you move from there. I think as long as we try, and I think time bears the statement out, we try to accommodate every idea, every notion, every fear, every dollar, you will never get there. And that's true in Decatur, that's true in the city of Atlanta where I live. That's just the reality of that. I mean, the zoning departments, representatives, all the folks that are responsible, arborists that are responsible for this at the direction of a leader, whoever they may be in the municipality, to come up with a solution.
I'll just add a little bit to that. I think that a lot of times these types of codes are not very publicly interesting. They're kind of boring to work through 40 pages of, 6 feet here and 2 feet there, and people's eyes glaze over. And I think that there's a kind of a fatigue that sets in, and people are like, oh, let's just get this done and send it off. It's not necessarily going to work, but let's just have it be done because we're tired of looking at it. And I think that there's an opportunity with a lot of people in the community who have a lot of expertise that are looking at some of that here, and there's lots of other people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and contribute to solutions that work. And some of these have been presented today, and I think there's a real opportunity to, make a little bit of a paradigm shift to create regulations that are really going to protect our communities for the future. If we don't do that, the whole metro area is undergoing another extremely large growth boom, and that's just what's happening. If we don't control that in a way that makes sense, our communities are going to change. It's not going to be like this anymore. We're going to create that densification that other cities did in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and we don't have the infrastructure to support it. We don't have water infrastructure. The Chattahoochee River. We don't live on the Hudson River. We're not going to be able to make this work the way some of those other cities did. So I think we really need to be serious about it, not treat it like something that we don't pay much attention to, but really take long-term planning and the regulations that make it work seriously. So I was just going to say one other comment. There's a lot of conferences that people go to, people in this room go to. Everybody has a nice little sandwich and a cup of coffee, and we talk about these really great progressive ideas and how to plan and how to have, cities that have greenery and our urban forest. And then when it comes down to the code, what really happens where the rubber meets the road is the same old stuff that we've been doing since the 1970s. So I think there's an opportunity to shift.
This one's for all the panel members. What about affordable housing? How do we save trees and have affordable housing?
Well, I think that Howard and Catherine both addressed that in their presentations. Therefore, I think they should answer the question. But sustainable footprints requiring buildings to be smaller should help lower cost properties maintain their value as property as opposed to land. I mean, as homes as opposed to land. So if you have if there's a little house on a little lot, and the house is
a lot is cleared next to it and a giant house goes on it, your house becomes a real estate asset, not a home anymore, okay? So I think that if we can reverse that trend where the neighborhoods are being crushed, as Catherine pointed out, by accelerated values, then most neighborhoods could stay intact longer and stay more affordable. If a city that you could maybe imagine, started to require very stringent tree protections and building footprints got smaller, perhaps the cost of housing would go down, and those who really had to have 6 and 5 or 5 and 6 or whatever it is, plus, an outbuilding that houses 3 might go elsewhere, and the neighborhood might not, could sustain pricing at a more reasonable level. But maybe not, because it would be such a desirable area that people would pay more for those houses. So we have a sort of a system